confrontation with the problem of history grew out of an appropriation of Dilthey's work. It was corroborated, and at the same time strengthened, by Count York's theses that are scattered throughout his letters to Dilthey. J2. The image of Dilthey still prevalent today is that of the sensitive interpreter of the history of the spirit, especially the history of literature, who also concerned himself with the distinction between the natural and the human sciences, attributing a distinctive role to the history of these sciences and also to psychology, and letting the whole merge into a relativistic philosophy of life. For a superficial consideration, this sketch is correct, but it misses the substance. It covers over more than it reveals. Dilthey's investigations can be divided schematically into three areas: studies regarding the theory of the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaft, and the distinction between these and the natural sciences; investigations into the history of the sciences of human being, society, and the state; and endeavors toward a psychology in which the whole fact of being human is to be presented. Investigations in scientific theory, the history of science, and hermeneutical psychology constantly interpenetrate and overlap each other. And one direction predominates, the others are motives and means. What appears to be disunity and uncertain, chance attempts, is an elemental restlessness, of which the one goal is to understand life, philosophically, and to secure for this understanding a hermeneutical foundation in terms of life itself. Everything is centered in the psychology that is supposed to understand life, in the historical context of its development and its effects, as the way in which human being is, as the possible object of the human sciences, and especially the root of these sciences. Hermeneutics is the self-clarification of this understanding. It is also the methodology of historiography, though only in a derivative form. In contemporaneous discussions, Dilthey's own investigations for laying the foundations for the human sciences were forced one-sidedly into the field of a theory of science, and it was with a regard for such discussion that his publications were often oriented in this direction. The logic of the human sciences was by no means central for him, no more than he was striving in his psychology merely to improve the positivistic science of the psychical. Dilthey's friend, Count York, gives unambiguous expression to Dilthey's almost philosophical tendency when he refers to our common interest in understanding. Dilthey's investigations are only now becoming accessible in their complete scope. If we are to make them our own, we need the constancy and concretion of coming to terms with them in principle. This is not the place 14 for a detailed discussion of the problems that motivated him or how they motivated him. We shall, however, describe in a provisional way some of Count York's central ideas by selecting characteristic passages from the letter. In these communications, York's own tendency is brought to life by Dilthey's questions and work, and this tendency can be seen in his stance with regard to the tasks of the fundamental discipline analytical psychology. About Dilthey's Academy treatise, Ideas on a Descriptive and Analytic Psychology, 1894, he writes, "It is definitely established that self-reflection is the primary means of knowing, and that the primary procedure of knowing is analysis. From this standpoint, principles are formulated that are verified by their own finding. No progress is made toward critically breaking down constructive psychology and its assumptions, explaining it, and thus refuting it from within. Your resistance to breaking things down critically, i.e., for demonstrating their provenance psychologically and carrying this out trenchantly in detail, is, in my opinion, connected with your concept of the theory of knowledge and the position you assign to it." Briefwetzel, p. 177. The explanation of inapplicability. The fact is set up and made clear is given only by a theory of knowledge. It has to give justifications for the adequacy of scientific methods. It has to provide the grounds for a doctrine of method, instead of having its methods taken from individual areas, rather haphazardly, I must say. P. 179. At bottom, York is demanding a logic preceding the sciences and guiding them as did Platonic and Aristotelian logic, and this demand includes the task of developing, positively and radically, the various categorical structures of the being that is nature and the being that is history, Dasein. York finds that Dilthey's investigations too little emphasize the generic difference between the ontic and the historical, p. 191, Heidegger's italics. In particular, the procedure of comparison is claimed as the method of the human sciences. Here I disagree with you. Comparison is always aesthetic and is bound to form. Windelband assigns forms to history. Your concept of the type is an entirely inward one. Here it is a matter of characteristics, not forms. For Windelband, history is a series of pictures, individual forms, aesthetic demand. For the natural scientist, besides science, only aesthetic pleasure remains as a kind of human tranquilizer. Your concept of history is, after all, that of a nexus of forces, unities of force, to which the category of form should be applied only in a symbolic sense. P. 193. In terms of his certain instinct for the difference between the ontic and the historical, York knew how strongly traditional historical investigation is geared to purely ocular determinations. P. 192. That aim at what has body and form. Rank is a great ocularist, for whom things that have vanished can never become realities. Rank's whole manner can be explained in terms of his limiting the stuff of history to the political. Only the political is dramatic. P. 60. The modifications that have come in the course of time seem inessential to me, and here I probably judge differently from you. For example, I think that the so-called historical school is merely a side current within the same riverbed, and represents only one branch of an old and thoroughgoing opposition. The name has something deceptive about it. That school was not historical at all Heidegger's italics, but rather an antiquarian one, construing things aesthetically, whereas the great dominating movement was one of mechanical construction. Thus what it added methodologically to the method of rationality was only a general feeling. pp. 68f. The genuine philologian conceives of historiography as a cabinet of antiquity, where nothing is palpable, where only a living psychical transposition guides us. These gentlemen never get there. At heart they are natural scientists, and they become skeptics all the more because experimentation is lacking. One must keep completely away from the petty details. For example, how often Plato was is Magna Graecia or Syracuse. There is no vitality in that. This superficial affectation that I have seen through critically finally boils down to a large question mark, and is put to shame by the great realities of Plato, Homer, and the New Testament. Everything actually real becomes a schema when it is considered as a thing in itself, when it is not experienced. P. 61. The scientists confront the powers of the times in a way similar to the over-refined French society of the Revolutionary period. Here is there formalism, the cult of form, the defining of relationship is the final word of wisdom. Of course, this direction of thought has its own history that, I believe, is not yet written. The groundlessness of this thinking and of the faith in it, and such thinking is, epistemologically considered, a metaphysical attitude, is a historical product. P. 39. The groundswells evoked by the principle of eccentricity that led to a new time more than 400 years ago seem to me to have become exceedingly broad and flat. Knowledge has progressed to the point of negating itself. Man has become so far removed from himself that he has lost sight of himself. Modum man, i.e., man since the Renaissance, is ready to be buried. P. 83. In contrast, all written history that is alive and not just depicting life is critique. P. 19. But historical knowledge is, for the best part, knowledge of hidden sources. P. 109. With history, what creates a spectacle and catches the eye is not the main thing. The nerves are invisible, as is the essential in general. And as it is said that, if you are quiet, you would be strong, the variation of this is also true: if you are quiet, you will perceive, i.e. understand. P. 26. And then, I enjoy the silent soliloquy in commerce with the spirit of history. This spirit did not appear to Faust in his study, nor to Master Goethe either. They would not have flinched from it in alarm, no matter how serious and compelling the apparition was. For it is brotherly and akin to us in a sense deeper, and other than the inhabitants of bush and field. These exertions are like Jacob's wrestling, a sure gain for the wrestler himself. That is what matters first of all. P. 133. York gets his clear insight into the fundamental character of history as virtuality from his knowledge of the characteristics of the being of human existence itself, thus precisely not in a theoretical and scientific way oriented to the object of historical observation. That the whole psychophysical datum is not being equals the being present of nature Heidegger's note, but rather lives, is the core of historicity. And if self-reflection is directed not to an abstract ego, but to the fullness of myself, it will find me historically determined, just as physics knows me as cosmically determined. I am history as well as nature. P. 71. And York, who saw through all false relational definitions and groundless relativisms, did not hesitate to draw the final conclusion from his insight into the historicity of Dasein. But on the other hand, a systematic that is separated from history is methodologically inadequate for the inner historicity of self-consciousness. Just as physiology cannot be studied in abstraction from physics, neither can philosophy from historicity, especially if it is critical. Self-relation and historicity are like breathing and atmospheric pressure, and although this sounds rather paradoxical, it seems to me methodologically like a residue of metaphysics not to historicize philosophy. P69. Since philosophizing is living, there is, do not be alarmed, in my opinion, a philosophy of history but who could write it? Certainly not in the way it has been interpreted and attempted up to now, and you have declared yourself irrefutably against this. The line of questioning up to now was simply false, even impossible, but it is not the only one. Thus there is no longer any real philosophizing that is not historical. The separation between systematic philosophy and historical presentation is essentially wrong. P. 251. Being able to become practical is now, of course, the real basis for the justification of any science. But the mathematical praxis is not the only one. The practical aim of our standpoint is the pedagogical one in the broadest and deepest sense of the word. It is the soul of all true philosophy, and the truth of Plato and Aristotle. pp. 42f. You know what I think about the possibility of ethics as a science. Nevertheless, it can always be improved. Who are such books really for? Registries about registry. The only thing worthy of notice here is the drive from physics to ethics. P. 73. If one conceives of philosophy as a manifestation of life, and not as the expectoration of a groundless thinking, and such thinking appears groundless because one's look is turned away from the ground of consciousness, the task is as meager in its results as it is complicated and laborious in arriving at. Freedom from prejudice is what it presupposes, and that is difficult to obtain. P. 250. That York set out to grasp the historical categorially, as opposed to the ontic ocular, and to elevate life into its appropriate scientific understanding, becomes clear from his reference to the kind of difficulty of such investigation. The aesthetic and mechanistic kind of thinking is more easily expressed verbally than an analysis that goes behind intuition, and this can be explained by the wide extent to which words have their provenance in the ocular. On the other hand, what penetrates to the ground of vitality eludes an exoteric presentation, hence all its terminology is not intelligible to all, it is symbolic and inevitable. From the special kind of philosophical thinking follows the special character of its linguistic expression. pp. 70f. But you are familiar with my predilection for paradox, which I justify by the fact that paradox is a mark of truth, that the communis opinio is surely never in the truth, but is like an elemental precipitate of a halfway understanding that makes generalizations. In its relationship to truth, it is like the sulfurous fumes that lightning leaves behind. Truth is never an element. To dissolve elemental public opinion, and, if possible, to make possible the shaping of individuality in seeing and regarding, would be a pedagogical task for the state. Then instead of a so-called public conscience, instead of this radical externalization, individual conscience, i.e. conscience, would again become powerful. pp. 249f. If one has an interest in understanding historicity, one is brought to the task of developing the generic difference between the ontic and the historical. Thus we have ascertained the fundamental goal of the philosophy of life. Still, our line of questioning needs a more fundamental radicalization. How else is historicity to be philosophically grasped and categorially conceived in its difference from the ontic than by bringing the ontic, as well as the historiographical, into a more primordial unity so that they can be compared and distinguished? But that is possible only if we attain the following insights. 1. The question of historicity is an ontological question about the constitution of being of historical being. 2. The question of the ontic is the ontological question of the constitution of beings unlike Dasein, of what is present in the broadest sense. 3. The ontic is only one area of beings. The idea of being encompasses the ontic and the historiographical. This idea is what must be generically differentiated. It is not by chance that York calls non-historical being simply the ontic. That just reflects the unbroken dominance of traditional ontology that, coming from the ancient questioning of being, holds fast to the ontological problematic and fundamentally narrows it down. The problem of the difference between the ontic and the historiographical can be worked out as a problem to be investigated only if it has made sure of its guideline beforehand by clarifying, through fundamental ontology, the question of the meaning of being in general. Thus it becomes clear in what sense the preparatory existential and temporal analytic of Dasein is resolved to cultivate the spirit of Count York in the service of Dilthey's work.